Welcome to the Brainiate Show, where we talk about all things Salesforce, sharing the coolest features, solutions, and best practices to turn you into a Salesforce rock star. Here's your host, former attorney turned Salesforce consultant and trainer, David Giller.
Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. I am so excited to see all of you today. And by the way, welcome to all of those folks who are watching the replay. We don't hold it against you if you couldn't make it for the actual live show. I am super excited to have Adam with me today. I actually faced the right direction this time. Adam, how are you?
I'm very good, David. A pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is a very hot topic, or I should say two hot topics that you're going to be talking about today. So I'm super excited about that. I was actually chatting for all of you in the audience. I was chatting with Adam about that for the last couple of minutes. There's been a lot of interest from the time that that we announced that these topics were going to be covered in this show. A lot of interest in it. But anyway, for those of you who have never joined the weekly live show before, I want to welcome all of you. I just want to explain to you the format of the show. It's just an hour long, and it's broken up into 3 segments, approximately 20 minutes each. Sometimes we go a little bit over in one topic or the other, but approximately 20 minutes each for each segment. Today, the first segment is going to be, yes, admin, you can code too. The second segment is going to be learning basic code in no time. Adam is going to teach us. And by the way, when I say us, I am included here because when it comes to code, to me, it's a whole other language. So I'm going to be learning along with all of you. The third segment is open Q&A. So if at any point throughout the next hour you have any question, whether it's a question specifically about anything that we're talking about during the show or any other Salesforce related question, feel free to drop it in the comments. It's better if you put a Q beforehand so that this way we can see like, oh yeah, that's a question versus a comment, a response to somebody else. But in the third segment, we're going to be taking a look at any questions that any of you put for either one of us, or maybe even for someone in the audience to answer. But without further ado, let's jump into the first segment. Adam, you ready? And you're going to be sharing your screen. So ready? Adam?
All right, sharing my screen in the first segment?
Yeah. Yes, admin, you can code too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm looking at your screen in the meantime, so you're going to need to adjust what you have up on the screen there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. We are ready for you.
All right. So I'm just going to share the one slide and then we'll get into some more discussion here. But I'm actually very glad you kind of explained code as a different language because I actually would disagree. I don't think code is actually another language. In fact, I believe that you as a Salesforce admin are actually speaking the language of code. And that's really because at the end of the day, whether you're writing code or whether you're writing in Salesforce declarative tools, you're speaking computer language, right? Ones and zeros.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, if you've ever tried to learn another language, you'll notice, the farther away you get from the source, things tend to get lost in translation, right? And what Salesforce tries to do is it tries to take everything you're doing on the declarative side and convert it into ones and zeros that it as a computer can understand. And so all I'm really doing in code is the same things that an admin is doing declaratively, just one step closer to the source ones and zeros. So a little less getting lost in translation. There's a little bit more that I can do, but I'm actually doing kind of the exact same things.
Love it.
And you might actually have a little experience with this if you've ever built like a formula, right? Whenever you build a formula in code, you check that button, check syntax, and it will try to say, hey, can I convert this formula you wrote into ones and zeros that Salesforce can understand? And so all that's really doing is it's trying to translate what you wrote into code. And so at the end of the day, right, as Salesforce admins, these are a lot of the kind of key concepts that you work with, right? when you build formulas, when you write workflows, when you write process builders, when you write flows, that's all, right? You're using a lot of conditional logic, right? If this condition is true, then, set this value or fire off this automation, right? You have all these conditions to check. And in Apex, right, when you're writing code, it's the exact same thing. You're using if statements, right? You're saying if this condition is true, then let's execute this block of code. Or if this other condition is true, let's execute this other block of code. But it's the same thing you're doing on the admin side. And right, these concepts can be applied even further, right? When you're creating fields on the Salesforce side, all you're doing when you're creating a field, you're telling Salesforce, okay, well, what is the name of my field? What type of field is it going to be, right? Is it going to be a number? Is it going to be a text, etc.? And then when you populate the record, you give it a value. And again, it's the same thing in Apex. We just call them variables, right? I have to specify a name for my variable. I have to tell Apex what type of variable I'm going to have, right? If you build flows, you're already familiar with a lot of these concepts also, creating variables and flows and things like that. Again, you have to give the variable a name and you have to give it a type, but it's really no different in Apex, right? And if we keep going, right, when you build complex formulas, all you're doing is taking, right, some input or some field values that you know. Maybe you're applying some functions to them. Maybe you're doing some kind of checks yourself, some logic, right? If these two conditions are true, then I want to assign a certain value. And again, in Apex, it's the same thing. We call them methods and classes, but it's really just little blocks of code that you're taking some input, you're doing some calculation or logic checks on, and then you're assigning values as a result.
Makes
right?
sense.
When we're talking about querying for records as an example, right? You could be building a report in Salesforce. And if you think about how reports work, right? At the end of the day, you choose what objects you want to search for records on. You choose how the records should be grouped or the fields you want to gather. And then you put in some sort of filter criteria, right? How do I want to filter the records to return a certain set back? And again, in Apex, we do the same thing. We call it sockwool, and it looks a little bit different. But it's the same concept. We just select some fields from some object where some condition is true. And it's pretty much the same as a Salesforce report. Right? When you build automation, right? Previously workflows and process builders, and now pretty much everything's in flow. But again, the way a lot of these work, I'm talking specifically about record triggered flows here. You choose an object and you choose when your automation should fire. And in the case of flows, we have the option, do we want it to fire before records are saved, after records are saved? And again, it's the exact same thing in Apex. They're just Apex triggers instead. And again, they have a certain syntax, right? You have to have the word trigger, and you have to have the object that you want the trigger to run on, and then you have when the trigger is going to fire. But the syntax you could always look up. The actual concept is the exact same. Right, in processes and flows, we could also have a loop element, right? And the loop is going to take a set of records and loop over them one by one, and then it's going to basically do something on them, check something, update something, etc. And in Apex, again, it's the same thing. These are for loops, right? For each record in a list, let me loop through them one by one and do something. And then lastly, right, in automation on the declarative side, whether it's workflow, process builder, flow, we have this concept of inserting records, updating records, deleting records in the case of flow. And again, we do that in Apex, and we use the words insert, update, and delete in our code. But it's the same concept. So I would definitely strongly argue if you are building applications on the declarative side of the platform, you are coding, even if you don't know it. And one of the things when I started working with Salesforce in 2014, now it's Platform App Builder, but at the time it was Force.com Developer was the name of the certification. And I was actually sad when they retired that name, because to me, a Force.com Developer is really a better description of what you're doing. You're developing, whether it's directly through code or whether it's kind of one abstraction level away from code, you're still coding, whether you know it or not.
Makes sense.
Cool. And so I think we're also going to walk through kind of an example of seeing some sample code here and how to debug it through the developer console. So unless, I don't know if anyone had any questions on the previous slide, but I can jump into the demo also.
No questions yet. Folks
Cool.
are super
All right.
excited to
So
be here. Julian says it's a great analogy. Hold on, let me throw Julian's comment right here. Julian says it's a great analogy. I think Julian's less intimidated now, as am I.
awesome. Yeah, one of the things I hear from admins a lot is like you said, it's a different language. I don't understand it. And you do, right? And I think, we can walk through some of the syntax and some of the syntax you can look up. I don't remember all the syntax all the time. But if you can do a good Google search and understand how the code works and understand the code, you can definitely even write code yourself.
And it's true. When you think of it, most admins, even aside from working with Flow or Process Builder, where it's more on the declarative side, just as it relates to formula fields and validation rules, most admins have, for better or for worse, have built, whether we've inherited formula fields or validation rules that we had to detangle or edit, or we've had to create our own, have taken those baby steps into translating the syntax that's used in validation rules and formula fields. And you're right, that is code, even though we might not think of ourselves as developers.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure a lot of people out there have, tried to understand what a very complex validation rule is doing or understand how a complex formula works, or I've seen some screenshots lately from very complex flows that people have built. And again, it's one abstraction level away, but it's all code under the hood.
Yep.
And so if you're building those things already, you are coding. Cool. So I'm going to walk through a kind of a basic example here. So I'm going to start with the account object. And I created a basic validation rule on this account object. And all it says is, and let me know if I need to zoom in on my window at all.
No, you're good.
But all this says is that if on my account, I want to throw a validation error if the billing state on the account is blank and the annual revenue is greater than $100,000. And so for admins, you may be familiar with this, right? And function here where I could say, and two values. And again, we have that check syntax button. This is Salesforce's kind of translator saying, hey, can I understand this in terms of ones and zeros? And here it works. When we're writing code, instead of to me, this reads a little weird. We say, and is blank billing state, comma, annual revenue 100,000. To me, at least, it's much more intuitive to, instead of using the and function, to use this double ampersand. And now it says, is blank billing state and annual revenue is 100,000, right? So little tweaks like that are some of the differences in code where we'll, portray and using this double ampersand. But again, other than that, right, this works the same way. And so that's my validation rule on the account. So if the annual revenue is more than 100,000, I want the billing state to be populated. And I'm going to go take a look at some code now, and then we'll walk through creating an account and see what happens when we create the account. So I'm going to open up my developer console. And so I recommend playing around with this in a dev sandbox or a Trailhead playground rather than your org. But from this same way we get this set up,
we shouldn't be doing it in production with hundreds of other Salesforce users.
So, well, that, and actually you are not able to edit Apex code directly in production. Salesforce will not let you do that. So even if you try to, it'll stop you.
Right.
It's one of the good and bad things, right? And I have edited validation rules directly in production before. And I remember one day in particular, it was the Wednesday before the long weekend for Thanksgiving. And Wednesday afternoon, I activated a validation rule in production, and it stopped anybody from being able to create opportunities. And that was a fun thing to debug at the last minute before a long weekend.
Ouch.
But yeah, always recommend sandboxes or developer orgs first. But yeah, here I'm going to open the developer console. I can open it as its own window, or I'm going to max. If I hold down Command, it'll open as another tab. I like this better because I don't like having a bunch of extra windows. And I'm going to start off by looking at an account trigger. And so again, triggers work just like flow record-based triggers work, right? They fire on some event for some object. And if I go into my org and in the setup menu search for Apex trigger, I'll be able to find all my triggers. I can see which ones are active. And every trigger is going to start out the same way, right? And again, you don't need to memorize this. You can look it up later. But it's always going to be the word trigger, the name of my trigger. I'm going to see what object my trigger is on, and I'm going to see when my trigger is going to fire. So for this trigger, for example, it's going to fire on the account object, and it's going to fire anytime records are inserted and update, both before or after in the order of execution. So knowing that, right, and again, this is similar to if I built a record triggered flow and I said, hey, I want it to fire right before accounts are saved or after accounts are saved. And so here, if you ever come across something in code you don't understand, you could always look it up. So for example, this is before, trigger.isBefore. So I could just look up trigger.isBefore, and it'll take me to the Salesforce Developer website. And it'll tell me, okay, isBefore means this returns true if the trigger was fired before records were saved, compared to isAfter if it's firing after records are saved. So basically, when I insert an account, this is going to fire both before insert, and it's going to fire again after insert. And so depending on which time the trigger is running, this variable is either going to be true or false. And then just like in our formula fields or in validation rules, right, we have the word if, right? And then we're just checking a few things here, similar to how I did in my validation rule. I'm checking to see, is the trigger running in a before context, so before records are saved? And then I'm checking to see if the trigger is either insert or update. So if I wanted, I could have different logic for insert and update. Here I'm doing the same thing. And again, I can look up what those mean. Is insert returns true if the trigger is being fired because records were inserted? Is update is true if it was fired because records are being updated? And so I do this. And then one thing that's nice about code, I think you can start doing this in flows now also, is you can drop in little just like lines of text that help you figure out where you are in the code or what a value is at a certain time. And so we can do that using the system.debug. And again, if you're confused how it works, feel free to Google, system.debug. Sometimes you may need to put Salesforce after it. There's also a great website Dan Appleman created called searchtheforce.com, where it automatically appends Salesforce to your Google search. But this will tell me, this isn't what I want actually. Let me look up just system class Salesforce. And I can look up system.debug and it'll basically tell me what it'll do here. And so debug will basically let me put in some value and then it'll print it out to the screen. So here I want to print out somewhere, if I'm looking in my logs after my code runs, here in line 4, it's going to print out the words before insert or update account trigger is running. Just so when I'm trying to figure out where I am in my code, it's going to tell me, hey, you're here. All right, the next thing it's going to do, and this is really the way you have to start looking at code. Just go line by line, figure out piece by piece what it's doing. And it's okay if you don't get it all at first, right? It's okay to get parts of it and kind of cobble together what it's doing. Usually good code will have comments in there to kind of give you some inclination of what it's doing as well. But here, so if my trigger is running in a before context, if it's running because accounts were either inserted or updated, I'm going to print out this line in line 4. And then line 5, I'm calling something called the account trigger handler. So this goes back to what I mentioned before, similar to formulas. In Apex, we have methods and classes. So classes basically are just a file, right? You might like have a Word document or a PDF. A class is just a code file. And so I have a code file. And again, if I look up in here, Apex classes, I could see all the Apex classes that are in my org as well. And the classes, again, similar to triggers, are all going to start the same. They're going to usually have the word public. Maybe it'll have global, but it'll have some word here. It's going to have the word class, and it's going to have the name of the class. And then in the case of my trigger, I'm going to look in this account trigger class, right? So one of the things to get to kind of know about code is a lot of times you'll jump around because you don't want to put all your code in one file, because then it gets very messy, very hard to use. Very hard to troubleshoot. So best practice is to try to make each block of code as small as possible. And so here I'm going to have a specific method called handle before. And again, you can think of methods kind of like formula fields, right? They take some input, they do some calculation, and then they either update some values or spit out some output. And so in my case, I'm going to call a method called handleBefore in this account trigger handler class. And I'm going to give it an input trigger.new. And again, if I go back to my search, I don't know what that means. I see trigger.new is going to be a new version of all the records that were inserted or updated. So basically, if I run data loader and I insert 100 accounts, trigger.new is going to have those values of 100 accounts. If I go and update 100 accounts with data loader, right? Let's say I'm updating the annual revenue field on all 100 accounts. Trigger.new is going to have those 100 accounts I'm updating with the new account revenue value. And then we're also going to see another value in here, trigger.old. And this is basically going to be the non-updated versions. And so in code, this is going to let me compare the old and the new values. And I can see, okay, if a certain field changes, maybe I want to take some action. But here, all I'm doing is I'm sending it, hey, give me all the new accounts that were either inserted or updated. And then when I go into my account trigger handler class, I look for the handleBefore method. So here I see a method called handleBefore. And because we sent it all of our new accounts, it's going to take in a list of accounts called new accounts. Again, remember, variables are similar to custom fields you might create, right? It has a name and it has a type. So this is going to be a collection of accounts called new accounts. And in line 4, I'm going to print out how many accounts I'm looking at. And so again, right, we can look up how to print it out. Different languages have different options, but basically .size just means, hey, how many accounts are in this new accounts variable? And so I'm going to print this out in my log. And then just like I would in a flow, I'm going to have a for loop. And my for loop is going to say for each account that I'm going to call ACCT that exists in my new accounts, I want to do something with that ACCT. So line 6 here, I'm going to print out some more text to my log. I'm going to check the account with the annual revenue of, and then just like in our formula fields, we'll use dot notation. So here I'm going to check the annual revenue field on this account that I'm looking at. So we're currently calling our account, we're looking at ACCT. We can call it whatever we want. Again, just like with fields, we have to give it a name so we can keep track of it. And then just like in, we might have a formula field where we have, a multiple conditional statement. So here we're saying if the annual revenue is greater than 5 million, set the customer priority on that account to highest. And again, just like in our formula fields or validation rules, when we insert the field, it's going to pull the API name in. So the API name is usually just whatever you named the field, and then it adds __C to indicate that it's custom. Where the annual revenue field is a standard field, so it's not going to have that suffix at the end. But all this code is doing is saying, okay, if the annual revenue is greater than 5 million, set the priority to highest. If that's not true, let's check to see if it's greater than 3 million, set the priority to high. Otherwise, see if it's greater than 1 million, set it to medium. And if none of those conditions are true, set the priority to low. And then the last thing we're doing in line 16, we're just going to print out, hey, what did we set the priority to, right? And so we can check to see in our code when we're looking through the log, okay, the priority was changed to that. So if we know it was a wrong value, we'll be able to see basically why was assigned a certain value. All right, let's go see it in action. And then we can walk through and see if hopefully I didn't lose anybody there. But we can walk through it again and see it in action.
There is a question here that I think is worth looking at right now. So Julie wants to know, is there no save operation needed? Because I also noticed that you were not hitting save. So is it saving automatically or what?
That's a very good question. So one thing I will say about code is, and this tends to be more true on the kind of JavaScript and Lightning Web Component side than on Apex. But there are some kind of little, I call them little like, forget what the like normal term is, but I just call it magic that kind of happens in the background that code sometimes does that you kind of have to just learn as you're going through it. That isn't always necessarily intuitive. Okay. So if this was an after trigger, so this was firing after records were saved, I would need to add another statement that says, like update new accounts. And this would be the equivalent of hitting the save button, right? It's like, when you create a new account, you can update all the fields you want, but until you click save, nothing changes. When I am running an after trigger, or if I'm working on a different object other than account, I do need either this insert or update statement. Because specifically this is a before trigger, so this is before the records have been saved, part of the way the trigger works is it does automatically save the records. So when this code is running right now, it's still before the record has been saved. So basically any value I change here, I don't have to hit save because the before trigger is going to do it for me. But that is a very good question, though. And hopefully that made sense how that is working.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to go in and create a new account here. And I'm going to call the account Salesforce. And I'm going to set the annual revenue to 250,000. And I'll see if I try saving, I should get a validation error because it's firing my validation rule. So I have to update the state. In the meantime, though, I'm going to go back to the developer console. And I'm going to see that some logs were generated here. So if I am trying to figure out why something isn't working, right, I can kind of do some debugging in real time and get some logs in the developer console. If it is for another user this was happening, I can also go into debug logs in my setup menu, and I can specifically add logs for another user. So let's say I'm helping you troubleshoot an issue. I could add logs on the David Giller user, ask you to walk through the code, and it's going to capture all these logs for me. So here I can open up these logs. And again, just like with code, I'll walk through it line by line. Some things you can kind of learn to skip over. But here we're going to see that we fired off our account trigger. So we see something in here that says code unit started. And we see here it's firing off our account trigger on account, and it's firing for the trigger event before insert. So this is our before insert part of the trigger. And if I scroll down in here, we see line 4, we printed out that text that our before insert or update account trigger is running. So we see the number 4 here under our user debug, and there's also in the developer console this option to only show the debug statement. So again, it's helpful to figure out where in your code you are and what certain values are at given times. So here again, we see line 4, we had our debug statement before insert or update account trigger is running. So we see that in our debug log as well. And then we can go and eventually we're going to update some variables here. And finally, we see line 5, we are entering a method account trigger handler dot handle before. And so again, that refers to line 5, we're calling our account trigger handler dot handle before. And here now we see we've gone from line 5 to line 3. And that's because we've now entered this method in our account trigger handler. And again, our logs are going to show us, okay, we have a variable called new accounts. It's a type list of account, and it's going to print out what all of our accounts are. So we just have the 1. And again, we can see when we entered this method, the name was Salesforce, the annual revenue was 250,000. It has an owner ID and some other default fields as well. And if we keep walking through our code, we'll see, okay, line 4, again, we have another debug statement. We're printing out how many accounts we're checking here. So I didn't use data loader, I just went through the UI. So we'd expect to see 1, and we do in fact have 1 account we're looking at. And now we go to line 5 here. And again, line 5, we're populating this variable ACCT. And so, right, if there were 100 counts in here, we'd go through one by one, and each account would take the place of ACCT. We just have the 1 account here. So again, our debug log is going to print out what it is. Again, we see our $250,000 account. And we're going to go to line 6, and it's going to print out, again, checking account with an annual revenue of 250,000. And we did that. Again, basically, we had a debug log, and we printed out using dot notation what our annual revenue was. And then now we're going to go into our conditional statement. So our annual revenue is 200,000. So we would expect it to fail this condition, and it should pass this condition in line 11 and enter line 12. That's what we would expect it to do. So here we see we go through and setting our priority to low. Why do we set it to? Oh, sorry, 250,000. So it's less than 1 million, so we should set it to low. That's right, actually. So all those conditions failed. So we see, let's see, line 7, line 9, line 11. So we see line 7 ran, line 9 ran, line 11 ran, and then finally line 13, it executes because that's the condition that is true. We go into line 14, set the priority to low. Line 16, we have another debug statement to set the priority to low, and then we exit our handle before context. So even if you didn't write the code or necessarily understand everything the code is doing, hopefully by looking at the log, you can walk through where in the code it is. And if someone's running into an error, you can kind of troubleshoot where they got to in the code and maybe even what the values were at certain places. And then eventually we come down and we see here, okay, our before insert context has ended. Let's check our validation rule. And again, we see we have a validation rule called state present for large accounts. We have our validation rule here. It's checking to see, is there a billing state and is the annual revenue greater than 100,000? The billing state has no value. And so we see the statement in here, validation fail. And that is, sure enough, why our validation failed here. So sometimes messages are coming from validation rules. Sometimes they're coming from the code. In our debug log, we were able to see it was coming from a validation rule. So if I go fix this now, and I add a state, so I'm going to go add California. That is where I am. And let's go change this to 1.25 million. I'm going to save this again and now create in my account. I'm going to go back to my developer console. I see some more logs were created. And sometimes it'll create multiple logs. For example, this one was created. It was firing some duplicate rule that I have set up here. So sometimes you have to figure out where the actual apex is. So it looks like 2 or 3. Yeah, so another duplicate rule was fired here. And so this is the one I think that I want. So again, we fired our before insert statement. Again, we see that our trigger was running. I'm going to jump ahead to where we were last time. So in our case now we're checking an account with revenue 1.25 million. We went through line 7, line 9, line 11. Right, remember, those are our conditional statements, line 7, line 9, line 11. Now we'd expect line 11 to be true, so we should enter line 12. And sure enough, now line 11 executes, we hit line 12, and we set the customer priority to medium. We print out the customer priority was set to medium. We exit our before context. Our validation rule is going to fire now. We see that if I expand this event column, our validation is now passing, because we populated the state. And now we can go in here, it's going to fire do some duplicate check, and then it's going to fire our after trigger context. So right now the record has been saved, and now we're firing all of our after insert information. And the only thing we had in after insert was another statement in line 7 just to tell us, hey, the after functionality is running now. So we see line 7, it's printed out, and shortly thereafter we should see that our after insert finished. And that was the end of our triggers running. And so hopefully you're able to see, right, we were able to use a validation rule and some basic code to figure out exactly how and why an account was getting an error and then why it was being updated. And again, hopefully, right, some of this might be a little foreign, some of these terms here. But again, right, conditional statements you've seen before. The concept of debugging, we have the option now in Flow to do that. The concept of, right, firing off a method, which is kind of like a formula, right? I take some input and I end up using that input to do some calculation here. And then again, we have a conditional statement with multiple conditions. We update some value. And because it's a before trigger, like we were asked the question before, we don't have to save. If it was an after trigger, we might see another statement to actually save all the records though. But yeah, hopefully I've convinced you to some extent that you already understand a lot more code than you already do. And again, I would challenge you to go through in your org, look up your Apex triggers, see how they're all structured, see when they're firing, and even the classes, walk through line by line, see what you understand, what you don't understand. If you're looking at the developer console and you see a statement show up in purple, you could probably look up what that statement is. That means it's part of Apex. So the word for, the word if, the word system, the word public, right? These we can all look up. And then usually, the blue will be variable values or field values. And so walking through line by line, sometimes you can figure out what the code is doing, or in the case of our trigger, what the code is calling next. So we went from our trigger to our class. Maybe we're calling another class. Maybe we're calling another method. And we can start to map out what we're doing. And if you're getting a little stuck, in your developer orgs, feel free to, or in your sandboxes, feel free to throw some system.debug statements in there. We check with the developers first. Different teams have different ways of how they want to update the code to keep track of it. Sometimes it's kept track of in Salesforce. Sometimes it's kept track in a separate system like Git. But maybe even create your own kind of developer sandbox off of production and play around with it there, put in some debug statements. And again, you can walk through the code with just debug statements, right? We started off our before insert. We checked how many accounts we were looking at. This is what the revenue of our account was. This is what our priority was updated to. And then we had our after insert trigger running as well. And you can kind of figure out where the code is going and then kind of reverse engineer it and figure out how it got there from there.
This is great stuff. And you've definitely helped to demystify, although there's still quite a bit that I, myself included, and I think from some of the comments that I'm seeing online, that folks are trying to keep up with everything that you've shown, even over the last couple of minutes, which is great. You have certainly helped to demystify a lot of it in order to show that it is doable and we can tackle it. And to the point that you made before, translate the way we think now of configuration elements in Salesforce and translate that into the syntax that's used behind the scenes from a coding perspective with the developer console.
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to answer any questions, or if there was something that was tripping some people up, happy to explain it a little bit more as well.
There is quite a bit. So let me switch into Q&A mode. All right, so we've got a couple of questions. First question is from Barbara. Will your last system.debug statement be printed for each account updated?
So that is a good question. So in this case, the trigger is running. It's going to print the statement once. It's going to fire our handle before method. And the handle before method is going to print out this statement once in line 4. And then for each account that we're updating, it's going to, because we are in the curly brackets.
Hang on. Let me go back to sharing your screen. I apologize. Hold on 1 second.
My bad. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good.
Okay. Yeah, so another thing in code that is helpful, usually, not always, but usually in code, developers will always include curly brackets to specify what part of code is in that block, essentially. And you see if I click next to this curly bracket here in line 3, it also highlights the curly bracket in line 6, because that tells me it's all part of the same block. And so the way the trigger runs, it'll run this line 4 first, just once. And then it calls this method, handle before. And if I jump into handle before, right, it'll run the debug statement in line 4 once. And then now in line 5, we see the curly brackets in line 5 and line 17. This is all part of the loop. So everything in between line 5 and line 17 is going to run every time there's a new account. So if I have 100 counts in here, line 6 is going to run 100 times. Line 16 is going to run 100 times. And everything in that block is going to run 100 times, once for each account. And then it's going to exit. And then the before insert is going to be done. It's going to go into after insert, and it's just going to run line 7 once. If I had a loop in here that said, like, for each account, ACCT in trigger.new, and now I have this debug statement in here. Now, because I put it in a loop, now we're going to see that for every account, it's going to print this out once. So now we'll print it out 100 times for our 100 accounts we were updating or inserting. But the way I had it written previously, it was only running once because it was not in a loop. And so it'll only run once, I guess, for each time the after insert context is fired. And it can get a little messy because, right, I could have a scenario where I update something in a trigger, and then the trigger calls another trigger, and then that trigger also updates accounts, and that calls this trigger again. And so we can get into states, and there are ways in Apex to get around that. But it'll fire once for each time we are doing some sort of insert or update after those records have been saved.
Nice. And Barbara thanks you for the elaboration because she said she gets it. We're going to stay in the screen share because I think some of the other questions will warrant it as well. So Simon's got a question over here. Before triggers, don't add to DML governor limits.
Before triggers, don't add to DML governor limits. I don't believe so because we're not actually calling any DML. And so that is another thing to note that I kind of glossed over here. And you may have run into if you built process builders or flows that update on a lot of records. In Salesforce, because it's a multi-tenant infrastructure, they basically want to make sure you're not using more than your share of system resources. And so they have what are called governor limits, which basically means you can only run a certain number of queries, you can only update a certain number of records per transaction. So I can only run 100 queries for a single event that's happening. I can only run 150 DML statements. And so another thing that I kind of jumped over in the debug log here was anytime your code runs, it'll print out periodically basically where you're at in those governor limits. And this is where it fails. Maybe that's a bad update or a bad example. But if I look at the governor limits here, I'll see that the before context did not actually add any DML statements because we didn't explicitly call it. Because Salesforce did it internally, it does not add to that governor limit. So that's a good thing to point out, though.
Awesome. We've got a question here from Jason. Is it necessary or helpful to learn JavaScript in order to understand or learn Apex?
It is. So yeah, Java and JavaScript, a lot of people like to compare them to the words car and carpet. Like one is part of the other one, but they really don't have anything to do with each other. And so Apex is very similar to Java because it is what is known as a backend language. Basically, everything is happening on the computer side, so on the Salesforce side. JavaScript, on the other hand, is what's known as a client-side language or a front-end language, which basically means it's normally going to be happening in the browser. So when I run some code in my Salesforce UI, it's calling out to whatever pod you're on, running the code on Salesforce, and then returning the value back. When I'm running JavaScript, it's not making a call to Salesforce unless I tell it to. It's going to run natively in my Google Chrome browser. And so there are some similarities, like JavaScript also has conditional statements. JavaScript also has for loops. But JavaScript is doing a lot more things, I guess, magic, if you will, behind the scenes. And so I think Apex is a lot easier to learn and understand than JavaScript. If you're interested in developing Lightning web components, JavaScript is really a must for that, but not necessarily for Apex. So you can do a ton with Apex without ever really having to touch JavaScript if you want to.
Nice. Royce has a question. Can you show how the system.debug would show if you were to review the log?
Yeah, so one, I have this option to filter on debug statements only. So it filters everything out except for the debug statements. And there's also an option, I didn't really talk about it, but I can somewhere in here change my log level. So if I only want to look at Apex, or I want to ignore the validation rules, or I want to ignore the workflow updates, etc., I can change that in there. And you can also look up what those different levels do and what they'll show. But it'll basically show up as the event user debug, and then it'll also have the word debug. And so I can filter on them here, but I could also, if I'm going through them, I'll see here, right, I was doing some variable assignment, and then I had a user debug statement. So that just shows that I printed out something to my log here.
Got it.
So before insert or update account trigger is running comes from before insert or update account trigger is running. And again, this is useful to help figure out where I am in the code at a given time. And in some cases, also figure out kind of what before and after values are.
Makes sense. Tim's got a question. Do you always use Developer Console, or do you use something like Visual Studio Code?
Yes, so I actually almost exclusively use Visual Studio for writing code. Developer Console is easier, I'd say, when you're getting started for several reasons. One, I don't have to download a separate application and a bunch of extensions and then kind of configure the environment, right? Developer Console is just in any Salesforce org. I can just go into an org, open Developer Console, and it's there. So for actually writing code and editing code and looking through code, I don't use the Developer Console. I do use the Developer Console for running queries sometimes. So if you remember, I was talking, queries are kind of similar to reports. I can select some fields from some object where some condition is true. Billing state equals CA. And then I can query it, and it'll give me all the accounts where the billing state is California, just like a report would. So I use the Developer Console for that sometimes. If I am looking through logs, again, VS Code can do it, but I like the UI of the Developer Console better, specifically for this debug only checkbox. But when actually writing code, I do pretty much exclusively use the Developer Console. Or sorry, I do exclusively use VS Code. But when you're starting out, the Developer Console is an easy way to kind of look through code. You cannot create Lightning Web Components through the Developer Console, though. So one thing to keep in mind.
Love it. Christian's got a question. In the console, I see the term aura, and in the trails, I had the expression Apex and aura are, I guess he saw that Apex and aura are related. Is that the case? And if yes, what is the relation?
Sure. So Apex and aura are separate. Aura refers to a couple different things. The primary thing it refers to are aura components. And so in here, I have the option to create a Lightning component. And if I do that, it'll create an aura component. And aura is just a JavaScript framework. So you may or may not have heard of other JavaScript frameworks like jQuery. Facebook created one called React. Blanking what the one Google created. Node.js is another one. I don't remember which one Google created. But there are different frameworks out there. And so at some point in like 2014, I want to say, Salesforce adopted the Aura framework to create Lightning components based on. They have since moved to a less customized version called Lightning Web Components in 2018, which is based on not a specific JavaScript framework, but more kind of standard web technology. So I would not, at this point, if you're looking into getting into component development, I would recommend just skipping Aura components and jumping straight to Lightning Web Components. The one time you will see Aura in Apex is if I am creating an Apex method for either my Aura component or my Lightning Web Component to talk to, right? In order for them to be able to talk to it, similar to how, let's see, static void flow method. So if I want a method to be able to talk to my flow or my process builder, I have to use the word invocable to basically tell it, hey, make this method available for a flow or a process builder to call. If I want this method to be available to a component, I have to use the word Aura enabled. And that will tell Apex, hey, this method should be available for my components to call. That's the only time you would see the word Aura in Apex specifically. And that just means that a component, whether an Aura component or a Lightning Web component, is potentially talking to that method.
Nice. It looks like that's it as it relates to any questions that anyone had for us. Any other things that you want to necessarily share, Adam, for folks? By the way, I put in the YouTube chat, I put a link to the material on Trailhead. I believe it was a module in Trailhead for folks who are interested in learning more about the developer console, leveraging the material that's on Trailhead. It's called Developer Console Basics. But other than that, anything else that you want to share, Adam, before we wrap it up?
Sure. Any other questions that you had of things I could maybe clarify a little bit better?
Nothing that stands out to me. I think honestly, like I mentioned before, I think the biggest takeaway that I have from this session is realizing that everything associated with the words code or developer are not necessarily as scary as I thought they were an hour ago.
Okay.
That's a big deal.
I'm glad that hit home at least. Yes, I guess I can wrap up with these points. Again, to reiterate that, at the end of the day, code is ones and zeros, and Salesforce has given us these great tools to be able to kind of write code without actually writing code. But because of that, you as an admin probably already know how to write code, minus some of the syntax, right? Where do I put the curly bracket? Where do I put the parentheses? Where do I put the word trigger? Things like that.
And those can be
but
frustrating, but they're nuances.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, and one of the things the developer console will also do, it'll usually tell you if there are error messages. So if you're writing some code and you try to save it, right, it tells me, okay, there's a bunch of problems here. It doesn't understand what I'm doing here. And sometimes these problems are helpful and sometimes they're not. All this is happening basically because I missed a curly bracket. But it'll tell me, okay, there's an error starting in line 31. And that usually tells me, let me look around line 31 and see what's missing. Okay, I click on this and it shows up in red because I forgot his friend, right? I forgot to close that block of code out. So sometimes the developer console or a VS Code will help you through that. And yeah, definitely frustrating. Those problems, unfortunately, don't really ever go away. As developers, we miss like semicolons and, single quotes versus double quotes, things like that all the time. And it's incredibly frustrating when it's something small like that.
You're not alone is what you're saying.
But
which is
yeah.
good. By the way, there are two more questions that came in that we can address at any point when you're ready.
Oh, sure. Sure. So let me finish doing. Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just going to finish that by saying, again, we can, walk through code step by step and combine all these building blocks that you already know how to do into the triggers and classes that you see in your orgs. And even if you can't write code yet, if you can understand what code is doing and you can do the right Google searches, you can begin the process of writing code and taking existing code that's out there and populating it for your own needs. And if you understand how to work the declarative side of the platform and you add some of that Apex syntax in there, you can begin understanding how code works. And I promise you're almost there if you still don't quite feel like a developer yet.
All good. Jason's got a question, which is, outside of Trailhead, any other material that can help to further learn more on the path of being a developer and understanding code?
Yes, so perfect segue actually into to this slide. There are a bunch of Trailhead modules. Trailhead's always where I tell people to start. It's good for dipping your toe in the water. It's good for learning terminology. So things like Apex Basics and Database, Apex Triggers, Apex Basics for admins, Quick Start Apex Coding for admins. I'm just reinforcing some of the points. Beyond that, I just joined the Google Play team with David Liu, and he has a great website. Some of you may have heard of before, sfdc99.com. He has a bunch of content on there, in addition to some courses on Pluralsight that are definitely good starters for learning Apex as well. Women Code Heroes, a blog by a Trailhead evangelist, Kieran Jameson. Again, some great examples on there. I'm a coach of a program called Rad Women, just helping level the gender equality gap and teaching female admins in the ecosystem to code. So I highly recommend checking that out. Conferences like Dreamforce, Trailblazer DX is coming up. So I have a challenge if you're attending or watching online. Maybe check out a developer session. If you're attending in person, maybe talk to one of the developers. And I think you're going to understand more than you might expect. And then what's the other resource I was going to recommend? Oh, I have if you want to see this whole presentation where I kind of go through step by step and show exactly how the declarative side of things translate to the programmatic side of things, maybe I'll send you a link to that presentation, David. I think it's on YouTube or on Salesforce. I think you can link to it from my LinkedIn also, but I'll send you a proper link.
Yep, and I will add
it well.
to the description on YouTube for those who are watching it either live or watching the replay.
Yeah.
There is
right. You said it was
other question.
One more question?
Yep.
Okay.
Barbara's question is, does it matter what order in your code to pull SQL statements to use in your classes?
Matter what order to put SQL statements to use in your classes? Not really. So in general code, as long as it's somewhere, it'll find it. So for example, if I have this method here, if I have the method here, or if I have the method here, these methods can talk to each other regardless. Some languages are not like that, but Apex doesn't care what order things are in. In terms of my SQL, the SQL syntax will need to be the same no matter where it is. Right, accounts, and then it'll always be in the format of select some fields, the word from, some object, and then you might also have a condition where some condition is true, like right billing state equals CA. But it doesn't matter where in the code it actually is.
Beautiful. We've got a lot of folks who really appreciate all of the insights and wisdom and knowledge that you've shared in this session. Adam, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot in the last hour, and I have no doubt that many others have as well. And thank you for all the resources that you've shared. This has been fantastic.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Thanks again for having me on, David. It was a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day. And for everybody else, I look forward to seeing you in the next session. And by the way, if you're new to these live shows, you can feel free to check out the recordings of some prior shows as well. You might learn some valuable lessons as well for Salesforce professionals. But otherwise, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.